In March of 1992, Chrysler surprised the world by announcing that Robert Eaton of General Motors would succeed Lee Iacocca as Chrysler's CEO. After a lengthy and messy search, Eaton rose to the top, but there was one famous billionaire seriously courted as CEO that almost came to fruition and could have changed the fate of the company. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. If you're new here, my name is John, and this is the messy story of Iacocca's secession and the unknown candidate you may not have heard of. By the late 1980s, Lee Iacocca was a worldwide celebrity, as the man who saved Chrysler, became the face of the K-cars and minivans, paid back the loans that saved the company from bankruptcy 7 years earlier, bought Lamborghini, headed up the centennial of the Statue of Liberty, and was floated as a potential presidential candidate in 1988. But one thing he hadn't done well was name his successor, and by the beginning of the 90s, Chrysler was hurting and hemorrhaging money. The aged K-cars underpinned almost every model Chrysler made, and increasingly, their lineup wasn't competitive. But Iacocca believed in his own legend. He, and he alone, knew what customers wanted: chrome, vinyl tops, and rich Corinthian leather. Instead of investing in new platforms and engines, he had bought a stake in Lamborghini, begun an expensive partnership with Maserati that yielded the Chrysler TC, and bought Gulfstream Aerospace, Electrospace Systems, Finance America, EF Hutton Credit, 4 car rental companies, and more. The only result was shrinking Chrysler's capital by 90% over that time, from $14 billion to around $1.7 billion. The company slipped to a loss of $795 million just in 1991. One clear example of the company's lack of innovation was the New Yorker. While in 1989, Lexus had unveiled the LS and revolutionized the luxury sedan market, and in 92, Cadillac was coming out with the well-reviewed Seville STS, which later was to have an advanced V8 from the North Star system, Chrysler was plodding along with the 1990 New York and Imperial with sofa seats and a larger K-car-derived platform powered by a Mitsubishi V6, yet ironically, it still outsold the Cadillac. But through it all, Iacocca had deflected a decision on a replacement. Behind his back, he was being derided by his underlings for not wanting to give up the 4 Ps: power, podium, perks, and pay. But as with any major CEO decision, multiple candidates were considered. An extremely brief bio of a few candidates considered are Louis Hughes, an executive vice president of GM, head of GM Europe; John F. Smith, another GM executive who went on to be the CEO and COO of GM and later the chairman of Delta Airlines; Gerald Greenwald, he was a Ford alumni, had become the vice chairman of Chrysler and Iacocca's number 2, but he left in 1990 to run the failed United Airlines employee buyout. Later, he contacted the board and let it be known that he wanted the CEO job, but Bob Lutz said he would leave if Greenwald got the job over him. And that brings us to Robert Lutz, the Swiss-born U.S. Marine fighter pilot and a product-focused legend famous for the Viper and for buying a surplus military fighter plane for personal use. He was the driving force behind the cars Chrysler was set to release in the 90s. He became Chrysler's number 2 and the heir apparent to the CEO job, with many both internally and outside the company supporting him. But his outspokenness in criticizing Iacocca, for example calling him a doddering old fool when he knew Iacocca would find out, doomed his chances, with Lee laying down the law that ABL, anybody but Lutz, was the directive. And that brings us to Robert Eaton. In the list of candidates, Eaton, the successful head of GM Europe and the eventual successor, wasn't even initially a candidate. In late 1991, Chrysler employee Fred Hupbacher wrote a letter directly to Iacocca that Eaton should be considered. Although they worked for competitors, Fred and Bob were best of friends. Eaton had worked on the GM EV projects, the Saturn project, and GM Europe under his direction was the most profitable car company in the world. Critically, the board of directors loved that he was a team builder in contrast to the authoritarian style of both Iacocca and Lutz. Iacocca was approaching 67 and now 2 years past Chrysler's mandatory retirement age and had been torpedoing previous successor search candidates or dragging his feet on it. In late 91, the board began to meet to discuss the transition, but without Lee, and the message was clear. He could play along or be shut out of the decision. Eaton met with Lee, he met with the members of the board, and all were impressed with him. On Sunday, March 14th, 1992, Eaton flew to the States from Zurich and met with the board and Lee. After 27 hours, his contract was settled, and he was the new CEO and chairman. But through all this saga, there is one name that's seldom mentioned and whose interaction with Iacocca led the board to start to take away the decision from Lee himself. And that man was Roger Penske. Penske was a race car driver who turned to owning a Chevrolet dealership in 1964. In 1966, he started Penske Racing, achieving success in Indy and NASCAR, and in 1969, he bought a truck rental and leasing business. In 1988, he bought the failing Detroit Diesel from General Motors, later launching their Series 60 engine, and by 1991, the company had achieved 25% market share, a turnaround accomplished with the same management and labor that GM lost hundreds of millions of dollars with. Heck, 15 years later, it was announced Penske would buy the Saturn brand from GM, although that came to nothing. By the late 80s, his various businesses had made him an extremely wealthy man, and his management style attracted Chrysler. In March 1991, talks began, and by April, Chrysler directors were talking with Penske. In May, they were serious enough that Penske and Iacocca would meet. Penske's understanding was that he would take over Chrysler and Iacocca would step aside. Lee had other plans, planning to stay on for another couple of years, running the company and evaluating Penske. We can only imagine how infuriated Penske was, and by the end of the day, the potential deal was dead. Iacocca had torpedoed it by foot-dragging and refusing to let go of the reins of power. It's easy to imagine what the business would have been like with Penske in charge, but the fallout was, as mentioned above, the board of directors got fed up and started to take control of the succession plan from Lee and let Lee know that either he was part of the process or he was going to be pushed aside. Of course, after Eaton took over, Chrysler went on to tremendous success and became the most profitable car company in the world in the 90s, expanding on new ways of developing vehicles with their platform teams, which was itself built on how the AMC acquisition had done it, and a slew of new models like the Ram truck, the Grand Cherokee, Neon, Intrepid, and later the Cloud cars. But just 6 short years later, Eaton lost his nerve. Looking at the worldwide situation, he determined that Chrysler had no chance to survive. They'd already been talking for some time with Mercedes about pretty expansive joint ventures, and in 1998, they combined forces in what they called a merger of equals. And history tells us how that all went down. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, there is a button for that below. A special thanks to my patrons who make videos like this possible, and if you love the video, well, you're probably going to like this one right here as well.